Hello everyone, welcome to this evening's talk. Thank you very much for joining us. Tonight we are really privileged and welcome to welcome Barry Truax. I'm sure many of you are familiar with his work. I will let Jacek Smoliski, the other co-director of this festival, introduce Barry in more detail, and I, Tim Shaw, will just give you a bit of an overview of the festival if you don't know about it already. The Walking Festival of Sound is a transdisciplinary event exploring the role of walking through and listening to our everyday surroundings. The Walking Festival of Sound facilitates a meeting point for the international network of practitioners and researchers interested in both sound and walking. Through diverse events, we explore how walking and listening can augment and challenge the way we perceive, navigate through, and care for our shared environments. In 2019, the festival took place in 2 cities, in Stockholm, in Sweden, and in Newcastle upon Tyne in the UK. And this year, in 2021, the festival moves to Krakow and Edinburgh, but due to the pandemic, most of the events will take place online, such as this one. So we are a few days into the festival. It began on the 5th of April and it runs till the 25th of April. So please check the website for all of our events and for future things happening. I will now pass the word to Jacek, who will introduce Barry and this talk this evening.
Thank you, Tim. Hello, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here on this Friday evening in Europe and Friday morning in BC, Canada. And I'm really glad and happy to welcome Barry Truax to our second artist walk or artist talk within the festival. And yes, I don't think there is really a need to introduce Barry Truax in a great length, but nevertheless, I will do so. So Barry Truax is a Professor Emeritus in the School of Communication at the Simon Fraser University in Vancouver. He worked with the World Soundscape Project, editing its Handbook for Acoustic Ecology, and has published a book, Acoustic Communication, that deals with sound and technology, now in its 2nd edition. In 1991, his work, Riverrun, was awarded the Magisterium at the international competition of electroacoustic music in Bourges, France. Truax's multi-channel soundscape compositions are frequently featured in concerts and festivals, as you all know, around the world. And in 2015 and 16, he was the Edgard Varèse Guest Professor at the Technical University in Berlin. And I'm really happy to see Barry and know that he will present, he will talk about his approach to soundscape composition from a perspective of soundwalking as one of the most kind of crucial methodologies, and since we are all interested in soundwalking, I think it will be a very, very fruitful meeting. So, hello, Barry. Great to see you. Before I give you voice, I want to ask you: have the cherry trees blossomed yet in Vancouver?
Yes, they definitely have, and in fact, I will show you a picture of them at the end of this. At the end of this talk, you've anticipated my finale.
Great, fantastic. Great to have you, Barry. The floor is yours.
Lovely to be here, and thank you so much for inviting me. I'm a big fan of your work and think that it's very groundbreaking and also quite timely right now. It's actually very exciting for me to at least imagine that I'm speaking to many people all around the world simultaneously. So I think probably we have a few options that we can have exercised in terms of the pandemic and the lockdown that actually add something to our lives. Of course, some of you may be rather sick of looking at screens all day, but I think we do have something we can offer people, which is sound, and not just the visuals that we are used to. So I think this is a very unique situation that we are in. As you mentioned, what I really want to show you today is how soundwalking as a practice is central not only to soundscape studies, but also how it forms the main influence and model for soundscape composition, or at least one of the main models that we can use. As you know, the two main components of soundwalking, as I'm sure you've all experienced, are the focus on listening and the physical experience of movement. I think that putting this focus on perceptual practice, namely listening, changes everything about the process. It also connects soundwalking with music in the sense that we allow ourselves to listen with the same degree or a similar degree of intensity, which traditionally was devoted to many forms of music, at least before music just became our constant background companion or soundtrack in our lives. I'm sure you're familiar with what that means. I've often suggested that soundwalking can actually be thought of as combining the roles of the composer, the performer, and the audience into one integrated activity. They're so tightly integrated, in fact, that I don't think we can actually separate those functions at any moment. And I particularly, from a philosophical point of view, like the contrast this creates with the traditional Western model of music, which originates with a more or less omniscient composer who determines everything and is transmitted through a more or less obedient performer, and then affects the more or less attentive audience. It's a very linear transfer, and that, and even a hierarchical transfer, we could say. And that model, of course, is indebted to, for instance, acoustics, which studies sound as a similarly linear process, originating from what they would refer to as sound source, energy being transmitted through a medium and to a final receiver. And note those generic terms that are used. And how the receiver, in our case, presumably a human ear, is placed at the end of the chain, and perhaps with an eventual emotional or aesthetic effect as the final dissipation of that acoustic energy. Soundwalking clearly provides an alternative, a more interactive and systems kind of model. Of course, there are other models, even in communication back in the post-war period. The traditional message model of communication, our messages being transmitted linearly, and the catchphrase was always who says what to whom with what effect, right? But we haven't actually in communication used that model for decades. Have advanced to something that's much more systemic and information based. So we still face the weight of those traditional models, but I think it's rather liberating and even refreshing to participate in a sound walk. Again, from my perspective, that is it actually composition and performance and listening all combined? Well, you choose what to listen for, or compositional materials, maybe even how to listen to them, listening as a performance, determining how long to engage with any specific soundscape, that is designing the overall temporal rhythmic structure of the walk, choosing whether to proceed to a contrasting area, something more complex, maybe something more soothing, more agitated, and finally deciding where to come to what musicians call a cadence. And so from that point of view, it seems like a very creative musical experience. I also want to mention movement as very significant here in the sound walk. I know that there is some physiological research that shows that walking stimulates the brain as much as it does exercising the muscles. Again, a sidebar of the pandemic is that I think, at least particularly in Vancouver, people have been walking a lot more outdoors, right? And we're blessed with so many parks. Our Finnish colleague, Helmi Järvo-Luomo, designs memory walks with her subjects because revisiting a familiar context will stimulate the memories of the subject, memories of place, past events. So memory and walking are often very, very closely related. And I think that's quite significant, particularly in a screen age, shall we say. From a perceptual point of view, movement also creates a constantly evolving perspective. It stimulates listening as we constantly experience perceptual change, and experiencing change is central to learning. I think, wasn't it Piaget that talked about to know an object is to manipulate an object, or is to understand it, and this is inherent in any kind of oral perspective. I've been developing over the last few years more writing about acoustic space, I don't think it has been well understood in the past, but it is a perception that is constantly created by sound making events. Things have to happen. As a blind person, for instance, John Hall, for instance, would tell you, space is not just a container for sounds. And so we really come to know a place orally by letting it act on us and interact with us in terms of our listening. So as a result, our sense of acoustic space is quite central to our orientation in the world, and also to the relationships of what we could call an acoustic habitat. Now, in terms of soundscape composition, there are many varieties of creative uses of environmental sounds, some that I won't be dealing with today in terms of time: sonification, installations, indoor or outdoor, sculpture, specific events. But what I want to share today is my practice of studio-based composition. A little bit to my own surprise, I've actually been an electroacoustic composer for over 50 years. How did that happen? And for the last 25 of those, I have specialized in multi-channel soundscape works. So I'm going to switch now to my screen, and I'll add the sound in. I'm going to share the screen and share the sound, and want to refer to these this material. Okay, so when I started writing about soundscape composition, which is about 25 years ago, 1996, I think was the first article, I tried to put together general characteristics that I was observing even then in this evolving field. And they took the form of this list. And a cautionary tale, I think this list has been the most quoted thing I've ever written. Everybody likes lists, and not just students. You know, the 4 causes of the Civil War, or whatever it is. And for better or worse, I actually refer to them as principles. And I thought afterwards, well, I really meant general characteristics, and I don't want them to be interpreted as prescriptive in any sense. There are no rules that are involved here, but it in the sense, the scientific sense of when you take a lot of individual cases and induce or arrive at some general characteristics, a kind of model, then that could be called a kind of principle, or at least a working principle. So these are both inspiring and also perhaps problematic. So let me talk about them a little bit before we get back to soundwalking. I think listener recognizability of the source material is crucial. And that has several issues associated with it. First of all, will listeners recognize the sound by just the sound? Because obviously when we're in an acoustic environment, there's all these other sensory inputs. So that is something where, well, I think you have to take it into consideration. It may be fairly simple as, for instance, providing an ambient recording at the beginning of a work to just simply orient people, you have a general sense of it. Often in looking over what I've done, I think I also favor very clear, vivid types of material that are what I guess the field recorders would call a clean recording. They might even involve close miking or something like that, so that to try to make it very clear what the material is, and perhaps not have it too much obscured by ambient sounds when sound is your only sensory input for that. There's also the question of if I use something, for instance, I'm going to play a piece from the West Coast at the end of this talk. What if you've never been here? Well, you don't have to. You have perhaps analogous experiences. Maybe it'll remind you of a forest that you've been in, or a seaside. Or it just simply may in some cases be quite the other, right? And how are you going to deal with that? Recognizability, of course, of source material is something that in electroacoustic music is often deliberately lost. We can easily obliterate the recognizability of a source when we process. So I'm going to talk in a minute about how I look at processing, or how I treat processing. Now, the more serious characteristic in the sense of implication is that the listener's knowledge of the environmental and psychological and complete context is actually being invoked, and not just anecdotally. For instance, other composers who find themselves having to write program notes often, give anecdotal things. Oh, this piece was inspired by a book I read, my summer vacation, an idea, whatever. And people listening will think, oh, that kind of reminds me of this, that, or the other. But it's rather, well, we would just say anecdotal. It's not integral. So we actually, I think soundscape composers will tend to encourage that the listener's participation. In fact, one first-time listener to a piece of mine, that was the key thing she said. I participated more. And I had also played a piece that was more of a concert kind of piece as a contrast. But the soundscape piece, she said, I participated more in it. And that really is what we're inviting. Now, for the composer, designer, I'm going to use composer and designer interchangeably here. This is not how composition is generally taught. The traditional thinking about knowledge is about sounds related to each other, and any social environmental context is generally, in the Western tradition, is generally avoided or regarded as second class. Oh, that's program music or functional music or whatever. But I think then it gives the composer or the person who's dealing with field recordings, you have to use your environmental knowledge, your contextual knowledge, to influence the composition at every level. And that's obviously challenging if you're not familiar with it. So I'm going to devote most of today's talk to examples that show how that has worked for me. And then I guess the idealism that when we were all young postgraduates working with Murray Schafer and the World Soundscape Project, we were all very idealistic in the 1970s, and we were, well, Schafer had characteristically told us that we were doing the world's most important work. He has a gift for understatement, I guess. We, in the 70s, there was a kind of radical feeling about wanting to change the world. And I hope that the newer generation still experiences some of that. I know that there is a strong desire on many students to make a difference, particularly in terms of things like climate change and social justice and on. So what do we have to contribute? And I've actually written an article that is available on my website about acoustic sustainability, for instance. Notice what's not in that list. It might have been the first thing you would have thought of, the use of environmental sound. Not necessarily. I think usually that's the way that we start relating to place. But just as a thought experiment, I've often cited my work Riverrun from the 1980s, which predates the soundscape, well, not entirely the soundscape work, but it was during a period of both analog and digital synthesis. It broke into the world of granular synthesis, microsound. But to make sense of that, I used an environmental metaphor that the grains were like droplets of water that are very trivial at the beginning and then accumulate, particularly in British Columbia, into these massive torrents. One's called Hell's Gate Canyon, you can imagine that, and then broadening out to a delta region in the Fraser Valley. And even though the entire piece is synthesized, and I would even say no one would actually confuse the granular textures with actual water, but people tended to buy into, shall we say, the colloquial, you buy into or you accept that model, particularly to understand something that was very new to our ears at that time, and that it formed an overriding metaphor. On the other hand, I'm going to leave it to the musicologists who want to characterize, is Riverrun a soundscape composition or not? I don't like that formulation, but we're stuck with it. People want to categorize. I would say it depends on the way you listen to it. And in that case, Riverrun, particularly in the early days, and maybe even today, I think listening to it as if it were an environmental piece help people relate to it. Okay, so that's I think perhaps an interesting way to approach that. In general, what I'm going to be showing you is a range of approaches in soundscape composition that go from found sound. This is often referred to as phonography by analogy to photography. It generally it has more of a documentary feel to it. It tends to minimize manipulation, or to put it more precisely, I think it encourages transparent manipulation that is subtle and not regarded as a foreign element being added. In fact, it's almost necessary to do that. Every field recordist knows that nothing is objective about the recordings. There's so many choices. John Drever has 3 pages of choices in his article in the Routledge Companion to Sounding Art, for instance. It's nothing but choices. And the material itself is a representation, and it may appear to be flawed in some sense, or to make it clearer and to stand alone. For instance, you may clean it up, take out some wind noise that is kind of extraneous or whatever. You're always making choices about that. In fact, I'm not going to play the Vancouver Harbor ambience that's down here on the screen, but I often use that as an example when I play it for students and say, is this a recording as is, straight off the mic, or is this something that's been put together? And everyone says, well, it sounds like Vancouver. But when you listen more analytically, it's actually an 8-to-2 mix, 4 stereo tracks that have been mixed to stereo. I know because I did it. And it was designed for the Soundscape Vancouver 96 revisit CD. And we wanted to contrast it with the 1973 recording that had been made. All of the recordings will tend to fuse together because they're all made in roughly the same place of by the harbor. But it had to be 4 minutes long in terms of the CD. So we had to have our famous sound mark, the O Canada horn, but that only sounds at noon. And so if you were a purist, you would say, well, I only have a 4-minute period there before and after noon that I could actually include. Well, what if you missed the C-bus horn going across the harbor? Or more provocatively, what if there were no seaplanes at that moment, right? You would be kind of airbrushing them out, you might say. So there's nothing natural or ideal about it, but the people listen to this and think, oh yes, all of the sounds that we hear, I think I put in 3 seaplanes or something like that, and we hear some freighters, boat horns, the C-bus, and we hear the O Canada horn, we hear gulls and lapping water. All of those are typical harbor sounds, and everyone feels that it's naturalistic. But at what point would it have started to raise questions, Anyway, that means that the phonographic approach is usually a fairly transparent manipulation that it appears to have a more documentary aspect to it. Now, when we move towards the abstracted, and please note that in English, that past participle, the ED on the end, makes all the difference. I'm not talking about abstract. Abstract would be sounds related only to each other, usually the practice in acousmatic music. Abstracted means that there's still a relationship to the found sound. So that raises the issue of processing. I have to admit, I'm very fond of sound processing. I teach it, I practice it, I find it as an area of discovery. But I'm writing an article about this for an interdisciplinary journal, and I'm trying to explain how the language that I've settled on for the approach to being abstracted in terms of processing is that I'm working within the sound. And in English, our language is more transactional. We have subjects that act on objects, right? And of course, I'm doing that, but I'm trying to explain how I try to bring out what's already there. that would be a colloquial way of trying to say it, or composing through sound or something like that. The best will be to give you examples as we move along, because there's some specific techniques that I use. I also am anticipating the examples now. I'm also going to show that in many cases, the abstracted or sounds move us into the inner soundscape, the soundscape of memory and imagination, our inner world, and give us time maybe to reflect more on our relationship. At least that's my hope. You can judge for yourself as we get to the examples. And in fact, the range of approaches in my work now extend to what I'm calling a virtual soundscape or an imaginary soundscape, something that definitely does not actually exist in any form in the real world, but we imagine ourselves in it. So this is a very rich range of approaches. I think two of the three spatial perspectives that I deal with on this page are very closely related to field recording. So it might be, since we have many field recorders, I'm sure, in the audience here, including Jacek here, who's an expert in it. The fixed perspective and the moving perspectives are clearly related to recording techniques. You find a location and you let the flow of time across your microphones determine how the recording is going to go. And that's actually always fascinating. We also do soundscape monitoring with students, where just sitting and monitoring, which also allows them to make notes or starting to do an analysis. That's fine, but I don't want to imply that when we get to the moving perspective that you should necessarily start with recording a sound walk. I think it's too distracting. Unless you're really familiar with the technology and it's just a part of you, it's very hard to listen and to walk and to manipulate recording devices. Of course, today it's a lot easier, you know, but still, it's when people ask me, well, how do I get started? I don't, when we're talking about soundscape composition, I tell them a sound walk. Don't start with the recording, and they're a little bit shocked by that. But I think it also means that on the soundwalk, you start to listen to what is actually there, and then that can guide you if you decide to go back and record it. Of course, you risk maybe missing something wonderful, but whatever. So I'm not equating soundwalking with a moving field recording. It's also technically difficult to move and not get an awful lot of extraneous noise on the mics and so on and so forth, and that kind of thing. I'm not going to talk more about the fixed perspective, other than you can see this range of from found sound. The New Year's Eve is an unedited recording where you listen to an event as if it were a composition, which it really is. I am going to talk about the Copenhagen train station piece and Island and Hildegard's work. I think the only thing I might just do briefly, just to get some sound going here, is how you handle transitions, because the moving perspective is all about transitions. And with the fixed perspective, you can easily go from one sequence to another without it being, as long as it's not a sharp jump cut, probably. But crossfade would be the usual kind of thing, and people are kind of media literate enough that they don't find that particularly distracting. Hildegard's in her work Talking Rain has two wonderful transitions that between rainy soundscapes, quite common in Vancouver, of course, and she seems to do it with an irrational element, a passing car, that has nothing to do, at least at the beginning of the piece, with the recording of, well, a lot of it is in Lighthouse Park, and it is a natural soundscape. I'm going to play those transitions and also show you the spectrogram of them. And these are two sequences that I've just put together. They're not back to back in the piece. Those are actually quite beautiful, aren't they, to listen to? But notice how the passing car on wet pavement, if you identified it as such, guides your perception, and you become much more aware of how those two different rain textures, how they're different, right? Both of them go from denser to less dense. And in terms of the piece, she actually resolves the seemingly irrational element of the car, because she suddenly does a fairly sudden jump cut to downtown Vancouver on a rainy street, and you hear those cars going past for a little bit. The piece, of course, returns to the shoreline and at the very end of the piece. So she subtly resolves that seemingly foreign element that's there. Okay, the moving perspective is, of course, a smoothly connected flow of space and time. I'm very much of the opinion that sound creates our sense of space and our sense of time. We don't have a kind of a chronological clock and you know that from recordings, that they in the clock time is very different from the experienced time. So it's basically a journey. It's basically a journey of one sort or another. Hence, this is the one that is most connected to soundwalking. We can have simulated motion. It doesn't have to be in the original. And I've already mentioned, I find it interesting to transition between the real and the imaginary that are remembered, because I think the inner soundscape is just as important. If we're going to say that the soundscape is as people perceive it, well, then we have to acknowledge both the outer and inner aspects of that. There's the crossfade, and in terms of simulation, reverberation is one of the ways that this can happen. Just to give a historical example, the original Vancouver Soundscape in 1973 recordings, which is when I joined the group as they were finishing that, the recordings had already been done, but we were publishing the booklet and so on. The piece that was not straight up documentation phonography was Entrance to the Harbor. And that's been talked about many times. It's almost become a bit of a legend, is that the sound marks of Vancouver that you see here, including the Holy Rosary bells and the O Canada horn, which was at that time atop a building, now it's on the harbor. This voyage, the entrance to the harbor, past Point Atkinson, which is where I think most of the Talking Rain recordings were made, and there was, always has been for the last 100 years, a great diaphone there, which has changed 3 times since the one you're going to hear. That's in the documentary. But there was a ferry that would take you here and approach Lionsgate Bridge and other foghorns and bell buoys, and go under the bridge and come into the inner harbor and dock right about here. That was and in fact, we had been on that boat. But if you recorded on that boat, as they did, of course, you just get the motor noise, and it may or may not be a foggy day, and so on and so forth. So they had to piece together this idea of an entrance to the harbor. So it really is a prototype of the moving perspective in soundscape composition. But it was also done rather crudely. We barely had a mixer in the studio at that point, which is hard to imagine, but it was very good tape recorders, but at that point, 73, the mixing facilities were pretty limited. So it has a lot of irrational elements to it. There's no question about it. The foghorns are great, and they appear to approach and recede. I'll just play you a little bit of the opening just to give that effect, which is just manipulating the levels. As you approach the bridge, you definitely get the kind of traffic ambience. So all of that is fine, but on the other hand, there's kind of lapping water. Where's that from? Like, are we worried about how we're moving? Most listeners don't. There's so much media travel kind of, aerial shots gliding noiselessly through an environment. Everybody, I don't think we worries about the matter of conveyance. You don't need a boat sound. You hear the motion, you experience the motion. And then there's a fairly abrupt cut, which we won't go to the docking scene and people getting off. And then it ends up in a very small waiting room where there's a squeaky door and a lot of reverberation. So compositionally, you can analyze this as from the fairly wide open space of with the reflection off the mountains, which are on the North Shore here, to the opposite, the urban environment. Suddenly there's human voices, and we're in a domestic, almost domestic situation with this squeaky door and where the luggage was collected. I'm just going to play the opening of the piece. Oh, well, the duration, the actual trip would have been at least a half an hour. This piece is about 7 or 8 minutes long. And again, that could be seen as an irrational element, but it's not, because this foreshortening of time then is a kind of, can I call it manipulation? Well, it is, but it seems natural and acceptable because we also do that in memory. We don't remember, our memory doesn't last a half an hour of that trip, right? We shorten it, we edit it out, I guess you could say. We foreshorten it is, I think, the psychological term. And that's quite acceptable. So which seems more realistic, a recording that's boring and lasts the same length of time, or one that communicates? Well, I'm on the side of the communication argument myself. Okay, here's the opening with the wonderful traditional diaphone from Point Atkinson. Okay, you can see that by a fairly simple technique. We had a sense of motion there, a slow approaching and receding kind of motion, a simulation, as it were. Now I'm going to go to my own work, and I have documented now, I'll just change the screen here. I have documented, I guess I'm up to about 24 pieces in great detail, which most composers are a little shocked by. But it really started with the handbook and everything using HTML. And it was something that made very useful teaching material, as well as the possibility of a kind of analysis or whatever. And I'm going to, this is now over a 40-year period, actually. So it's quite unique, and I think it's quite useful from a variety of perspectives. I'm going to go to the first 8-channel soundscape piece that I did called Pendlerdrome, which was a commission from Denmark, or from a group in Copenhagen. And their theme, their project was on commuting, which is very interesting from a soundscape point of view, because if you ever think of, if you reflect on commuting, it's probably where you have fairly minimal listening as a sound walk, because you're really just absorbed in your habitual tasks, what's going to happen for the day, and how to avoid getting run over or any other bumping into people or whatever. It's fairly straightforward. And they had sent me 1 hour of beautifully recorded material. In fact, they commissioned, in the European manner, 12 composers, this great group in Copenhagen, and they sent each one of us a wonderful hour. I got the last hour of the day, which gave me the idea that the narrative would be a commuter arriving at the busy international central station in Copenhagen, waiting for the local train, getting on it and getting off at the next stop. I only had time for one stop, actually. It would allow two scenes that were called, I would call daydreams. So pendler evidently in Danish means commuter, and drøm is of course dream or daydream. And that of course gave the possibility of processing. I think I'll play an excerpt first and then discuss it. There is a nice anecdote in the story here that in fact, the recordings I was sent went the other way on. For reasons best known to the recordist, he actually came from the suburbs, went to downtown to Central Station. And I don't know why, maybe he had to go home and feed his cat or something. But what I had to do in order to communicate, because it wouldn't make sense for commuting, is to reverse the order of the actual recordings. So I'm letting you in on some secrets there. Okay, here's the second section. The first section just simply establishes an 8-channel that you are there in the station, which is very easy to do. It's just an overlap of 4 different recordings, which makes it appear a bit busier than it might have been, but that's what a busy international train station would be like. So now when we're picking it up in the second section, we're waiting for the commuter train to arrive, and other large trains are going by us in a kind of hypnotic pattern that then leads to the dream. Perhaps you were getting into a little dream yourself there. The documentation, and again, I don't expect you to understand all of it, but just to show you kind of what is actually a simple version compared to what I'm doing now, of how the tracks were actually documented. The technique, because I think some people here might want to know the technique of why that transition was so smooth. It was combining a loop. And of course, trains are easy to loop because they're often repetitive, and particularly when they're passing with a left to right swoosh, you know. And then a resonator was used on the same material on the same loop and just simply cross-faded with it. So this is where I was saying the technique is original and in parallel mixing it with and crossfading it with processed. And you can raise the processing quite shortly. So in case you want to know, here's the actual original recording. So establishing the sound, but then the passing train starts. All right, and you've heard the resonator. So going back to my working within the sound, the first two techniques that I was comfortable with were granular time stretching, which we call granulation of sampled sound. So for instance, the breaks, or sorry, no, the high frequency engine noise was actually processed in that way. So this is a stretched version of it, and it was floating above the dream section. But the part that you heard, the resonance, this is called a Karplus-Strong resonator, which again on my website and also certainly in the teaching materials on the WSP database is extensively documented. But it is a model of a string, the resonance that occurs in a string or a open tube, and with feedback. And so it was originally used to simulate a string sound, but if you feed it with sampled sound, then you can adjust the resonator. There's lots of other resonators that are easily available. And my point is that both of those in the time domain and the spectral domain bring out what's already there in different ways. The resonator, you can't resonate anything that isn't there originally, right? It doesn't add anything. But if it's a weak frequency, it can bring that out. If it's a strong frequency, well, you have to be careful how much you use because it might overflow. But other than that, it's stronger than equalization. Okay, equalization does the same. It's you can bring out parts of the spectrum, but a resonator then emphasizes them in a way and focuses the attention. And the time stretching without changing the pitch through granulation gives you more time to listen to the inner qualities. In normal perception, we balance off the spectral envelope and the temporal envelope. The brain is always having two different processes, at least two different processes going on. And as soon as you change the time scale, then you emphasize listening inside the sound itself. You're hearing it. Of course, in my case, you're also adding texture to it, which I'm a big fan of. I like doing that. It also, though, that departure from realism through texture, I think is also a little like memory, but that's up to the listener. So there's just some clues as to what, at least from the very first. This has been a very popular piece. It's actually still a great choice to introduce people to soundscape composition. It also, I like the fact that it goes against the cliche of the soundscape work. Oh, you just like, waves and birds and natural sounds. No, we can work with, remember the first study was the Vancouver soundscape. It was urban. In fact, most soundscape studies have been about, or a lot of them have been about urban life. And there's nothing that is more common to Western industrial urban life than commuting. And of course, I also, particularly in the second daydream, there's a kind of almost a musical quality of tuning the resonators to be quite beautiful to refresh our tired commuter. And then you wake up, just for the record, you wake up when they announce your station and there's a huge bang, which is actually the door of the train opening in the European style, highly magnified, and you get out and you're home, basically, or at least at the exit. Okay, I'm going to leave the moderators to collect questions until the end, if you don't mind. And I'm going to suggest that you follow the chat. I'm sure you're following the chat and can collect any questions that are coming up. And if you don't mind, we're just holding them for a bit. Okay, in 2000, the piece Island then extended this to 16 channels actually, but it also created a somewhat a highly realistic sound walk as well as a highly abstracted one at the same time, because instead of alternating realistic and processed, it combined them. It was thought of as a visit to an imaginary island. This is a real island in the South Pacific, but there's a little echo of it over here, which is a nice little touch of realism, Photoshop addition. And the sound walk, so to speak, goes from one shore with the very bright waves that are actually from the Vancouver soundscape, the little bright beach sounds, up a river that seems to be singing into a cistern or well, then climbing to a mountain lake, and then coming back down through a cricket-filled forest and arriving at the other shore. So I tried to keep the scenarios fairly gentle and suggestive. So you can judge that. I'm going to just play an excerpt of 2 sections. First of all, the waves at the opening. And now, that's a good example of how the rather, I like to say, hyper-realistic wave sounds, because of the close miking, contrasts with 2 seemingly extraneous elements. And I deliberately put things that are so abstracted that they draw your attention to where are we and what is that drone and what is that high sizzle at the top. Well, again, we can't go through the entire structure, but the big picture here is that tracks 9 through 16 are the original waves that have been actually divided into subsections. I recompose the waves, and there's actually a repeating pattern if you listen very, very carefully. But the processing sounds are 2 types. There is the low pass version, where you just take the low part of the waves and put them through the Carpel-Strong filter at a very high resonance, and that creates the drone. But the abstractedness is that they're being pulsed by the waves. The actual pulsing of the drone is there, and you're not supposed to, of course, unless you're an insider, know where that came from, but it is supposed to be hypnotic and otherworldly, and maybe suggest that this island that we're visiting is magical or maybe dangerous or whatever your fantasy suggests. The high pass version is the very delightful bubbling at the very top end of the original waves, and that's also resonated there. So resonating, and later we'll jump now to the cistern. This was recorded by my colleague and friend David Menacchi in Italy, who's done amazing field recording work for Fragments of Extinction, his website. Wonderful stuff. He had this great recording where he lowered a microphone into a well, a pozzo, I think they call it in Italy. And I've used, with his permission, this recording in several ways. So this is now the most enclosed space that you've gone into, a cavern or something like that. So there you can hear that those splashes and plops have been, some of them have been granulated and time stretched a little bit so that they're prolonged, but it just seems like a prolonged decay, and the resonances are kind of matching up to the ones that are in. Again, don't worry about the details here. I'm just showing you that the combination of the original sound and the process sound is there. So there, the connection, the abstraction, is more an extension of what's already there. I don't have time to go to, for instance, the forest part, but that one with the crickets is so integrated, the processing and the crickets and a little mosquito elongated going around, that I remember when I was mixing the 16 tracks, I had to alternate, take out the processed ones and then put them back in just to make sure they were all there. It was so integrated at that point. And many people actually like that 3-minute section, and sometimes say it's their favorite section of the piece, where you're just in a cricket-filled forest at night, and well, presumably at night. And that was also recorded in Italy when I was there. So those are two pieces that give you a bit of a sense of, first of all, how a narrative was formed, a very simple narrative was formed, and then how processing could be integrated into it by either extending it into a slightly imaginary domain, or the most banal, simply going into a daydream. Of the more recent pieces, I'm going to jump to the Bells of Salzburg, because it's the most phonographic piece I've ever done. It was inspired by the World Soundscape Project recordings in 1975, done with the Stereo Negra, and still absolutely gorgeous. And of course, Salzburg, if you've ever been there, is a city frozen in time, even the locals say that, with many, many churches, many, many bells in this sort of valley with the river, and with the Hohensalzberg, which is where this picture was taken from in 1975, that's high above. And you take a little funicular up to it and look down, listen down. This is the cathedral, the main cathedral here, this part here. And there's a square over here, but the main square is in front of the church here, right? And on the high holidays in the Catholic tradition, the bells are rung completely, all 7 of them are run, including the amazing Salvator Mundi, which has its own tower. I think it's this one, 14,000 kilograms, right? And it's absolutely incredible. And the other bells are in this tower. But with the squares around it, there's an incredible amount of reflection that is going on. And so you feel like you're immersed when you have the full peal of those. I say from personal experience, because I vicariously had listened to these recordings for 40 years and finally went to Salzburg and was in commission to do this piece. And I, at the risk of, taking coals to Newcastle, I took the bells back to Salzburg. Here's a historical picture, of course, the history, the political, economic history of bells. There's a wonderful documentary by Peter Brown about this, is how in wartime they were taken down and converted into cannons. And in that documentary, he has fantastic recordings of both the bells and the cannons and how they are transformed from one to the other. So they lost most of their bells in the Second World War, as had happened in many other wars. And in ¡61, here's the Salvator Mundi, they were reconsecrated, 5 of them. And they have the approximate pitches, and you can look that up. They are approximate, but they have certain partials in them. So all of the bell recordings from the Soundscape recordings extended from starting at 7 o'clock in the morning and going to midnight. And so the piece then, just like our summer solstice recording, I don't know if you really want to call this a sound walk, but it's moving through time, compressing time into an entire day, just as we did with the summer solstice recordings in 74 that you can hear on Soundscapes Canada. Of course, the problem of doing 17 hours in 17 minutes is an awful lot of choices have to be made. I'm going to illustrate, maybe I'll play it first and then illustrate how it's done. I'm going to take the midday section here, which is just the early morning, I'm sorry, the late morning really, and going up to noon. And we'll play that because it approaches, it also shows the incorporation of the ambient sounds, some of my favorite ones, the horses and carriages that are still there, taking people around the cobble streets, this wonderful thing where the kid imitates the bell. Here is the morning section leading to a partial peal of literally, I think, just 2 bells. No, the processing has changed quite a bit here. That effect of those resonances coming out is done by a process that I call autoconvolution. And I don't have time to explain every aspect of it, but it is all on my website under compositional techniques and also in the WSP database. And in fact, we have an entire tutorial now that goes through it in pedagogical detail. But let me just give you an example. The basic concept of convolution is that you multiply spectra together and lengthen the sound. The most common use of it is to simulate reverberation. You take a dry sound, convolve it with an impulse response like a clap, and the sound appears to be in the space quite realistically. In fact, it's a perfect model of reverberation in a natural space. Now, the trick is here to convolve it with itself. The symbol for convolution is a star as opposed to a multiply. And what it means is you multiply the spectrum. And that sounds very mathematical, which I guess it is, but what it means is strong frequencies get stronger and weak frequencies get weaker. All right, so you thin it out so the predominant sounds come out, which in this case, well, first of all, let me play you the examples. The two bells that you heard that at the end of that are these ones. I'll play them together. And then these are the convolved, the first time. I'll add in the second. Okay, so even that simple example there, you can hear that it prolongs the sound and brings out these resonances. It prolongs. So again, you're working within the sound because it only prolongs and emphasizes what is already there in terms of the most powerful of the harmonics. And I finally got to Salzburg in 2018. And although I'd been in many European courtyards and places where bells are being heard. And there's a kind of a diffuse sound field, as the acousticians would say. You're really immersed because the sound's coming from all directions with all the reflections. And in the 8-channel version of this, in fact, I won't go into the spatialization. It is in the documentation if you want to find it. But I use delays that resemble the reflection around you, so that it's always going around. All these sounds are swirling around you, and you tend to lose the sense of self in a certain way. The sound inside and outside your body. It's a very immersive experience in a very literal acoustic way. I've attempted, although the time is a little bit tricky here, to give you just a bit about the priest and the choir and the procession, because what happens if you do it to not just the bells? All of the bell sequences are done in that way, including the grand full peal, but over the internet and the interest of time, I'll reluctantly leave that for you to find on your own if you're interested. It's quite massive, but pumping it through these speakers, I'm not sure about that. The subtler one is the procession, because it is done then, well, maybe with the priest and the choir. So the choir, for instance, singing something like, now that's a whole sequence of melody, and they all those pitches will overlap. And the priest himself, which is intoned, becomes anti predominant. And here's just a little bit of that sequence, and then we need to move on. In case you're curious, the voices and the footsteps are because people are processing around the square. All right, I'm running out of time, and I do want to go to Rainforest Raven, but I'll give you just a brief listened to Chalice well, because this extended the technique of convolution to hybrid convolution. And that's where two different sounds are convolved together. I don't think I should take the time to, because I'm going to try to finish by 11:30 here, and we had a little bit of a late start, but well, I'll see. On the documentation, there's an amazing page of examples of how these hybrid convolutions were done. But basically, it's combining two things. One of them that was key was the well sound from Island. Established a lot of the reverberant characteristics that gave a sense of a cavern. So, and it could be convolved with actual water sounds to place them there, but it also can hybridize them into different textures. For instance, in the glass chamber, we actually convolve it with glass sounds, and so that the water is a glassy kind of characteristic. In this section, the Chamber of the Feminine, the actual Chalice Well in Glastonbury for millennia has been gendered as feminine, is a female voice. And once it's convolved with itself, you only hear the formants, the female formants that are convolved, and they seem to float around this cavern. So this is just a little teaser about a piece that has again, a sound walk, but of course this is my favorite example of a virtual soundscape. These caverns beneath Chalice Well are in legends, but they've never been found. They don't appear to exist. They're the legends about them as which are numerous, where Joseph of Arimathea, for instance, buried the Holy Grail to protect us from the underworld. All of that, those myths and legends, many of them, from a skeptical point of view, were invented by the monks to increase tourism, still works today. But this frees us up as soundscape composers to engage people in an imaginary trip. And again, the convolution gives you this sense of realism. So here's just a very short excerpt of the Chamber of the Feminine, for instance. As I go now to our last piece, the Rainforest Raven, I'll just throw out an idea that I think would bear further research. Again, in the context of soundwalking, we know that the physical experience of motion is highly salutary in many different ways. It would be interesting, and I did have a grad student who looked into this to some extent. When we hear a simulation, either on headphones or in a multi-channel space, is there a kind of what is called mirror neuron imitation? Like when we see the mirror neuron model in neuroscience, and I'm definitely not an expert here, it always talks about observing behavior. And I think it's always visual, surprise, surprise. But what if you experience it just auditorially? Do you have the same kind of physiological and psychological effect? It's anecdotal right now. I think we do, but that's an interesting situation. I want to finish with Rainforest Raven, partly because it's the last piece and composers always love their last pieces best, I think. But it's also a COVID pandemic related piece because it, why? Because of an emotional, I think first of all, it's not as much a sound walk as it is an emotional journey. And all of the sounds are recorded on one of our Gulf Islands, somewhat similar to the wetlands where we started in the preview here. And it's a little difficult just to give an excerpt of it, so I want to play the whole piece. It's 10 minutes long, and if people have to leave, I'm sorry, but I really would like to do it because it's the emotional trajectory that goes along. In the various sections, we start with dripping water, which is not in the forest, but along the edge of it. It's actually dripping down a cliff, and it was quite wonderful and very bright and very happy. And I start to resonate it and then combine it with convolution with wind chimes. And you never hear the original, but the wind chime pattern is imposed onto the dripping water. And I think it's nothing but joyful, frankly. It would be hard to imagine it as anything other than a very joyful, uplifting kind of experience. And then, through all of that, we are guided, I think that's the correct word, by a Raven. And the Raven recordings, actually I will play the original recording that is the central one. We spent a week on this island and daily walks through the forest. Quite wonderful sound walks, frankly. There's amazing amount of sound, even though would normally seem like a quiet forest. And the ravens flying overhead are very difficult to record, first of all, but they're absolutely breathtaking. And just for the record, everything that you hear in this piece was done on a mono cell phone recording, right? And of course, there's a lot of processing, and I don't think there's any limitation there. The original recording was the second last day. All the previous recordings, the ravens had been a little more distant, but on this day, I was kind of ready with the cell phone, and it went straight overhead, and it cried 5 times and off into the distance. And you can almost, if you really heard the recording on headphones, you'd probably hear me holding my breath. It was such an aha moment, such a peak moment, right? On the other hand, when you get home and you listen to it, it's there, but you may not hear the wings very well in this transmission at the beginning, but you will hear the crying, and then I'll show you how it got optimized. Okay, so a little bit of equalization would bring out the wings, and also I blatantly repeated the pattern so that it would become a little more obvious. So this is the improved version. I don't have time to go through all the processing. If you want to, everything I'm showing you is on the WSP database. We'll talk about that at the end. Gradually, more and more variations on the Raven are being introduced. You hear it first totally originally, and then there is a version of it that will just have a few echoes, and then more string, and then eventually we start getting into the darker part. The darker part of the piece, then, which happens after the midpoint. The midpoint of it, we've heard the water in all of its glory, but it thins out until it's just the predominant pitches. And then we hear the recording, the original recording edited as I just showed you, is at the midpoint. and then things start getting darker after that. And that's through stretching the wings, putting them down 1 and 2 octaves. And then instead of the wind chime, we have rain on the roof that's more percussive, and it's convolved with a gong that was in the same cabin, actually, and is very dissonant. So this is the dark part of the piece. This is where we have what literally used to be called the dark night of the soul. Now I guess would be the dark night of the pandemic. And then dawn happens. We hear the raven again, bird song comes out, and we end up, as I hope we all will, in just a beautiful natural soundscape that is somehow refreshingly normal once again. So here is Rainforest Raven. I hope you enjoy it. So thank you for listening to that. You might have picked up the very subtle little footsteps that add a kind of first person perspective right at the very end. And just to, before I stop sharing the screen, Vancouver has come out of its rainy winter and spring has arrived on my street here. This is my house, and we are all feeling a little more, despite the variants, of course, but my partner and I have had our first shots, so we're cautiously optimistic about enjoying the promise of spring when the city becomes very beautiful again. Okay, I'm going to stop the sharing and start sharing via answering any questions.
Thank you, Barry. Thank you so much for this immersive journey to your work, a sound walk through many, many years of very interesting, inspiring, and groundbreaking history. It's been fascinating to see how many different layers there are that we can soundwalk through. Like, we can talk about the technical aspects, of course. We can talk about the cultural, the personal, the emotional, as you mentioned, the archival ones, which are kind of dear to me as well. So yeah, it's quite amazing also how you mentioned at some point the HTML5 or that possibility to create a hyperlink kind of a database allows you to create that platform for, you know, breaking down your pieces into components and then opening them up to other people. I think that's kind of a very interesting aspect of it, which couldn't have been predicted when you were working on those pieces originally, I assume.
Exactly.
I have lots of questions. I was privileged to have almost a year when I was in Vancouver to ask you a lot, so I will try to withdraw from asking questions and look straight into the chat. We have several questions, and there's a lot of greetings and appreciation of your work. But we can start from a question asked by Georgios Varautzos, who asks, how do you differentiate yourself from the field recording and being the recordist? Is your presence generating alternative soundscapes?
Well, I mean, first of all, in terms of field recording, as you know, I've been very spoiled by having access to the WSP database for the last 45 years. And so we have had these expert recordings that are done not just by the original group, but also in the 90s and the 2000s, and then that you did and contributed generously last year so I've only done, by comparison, I would say fairly amateur recordings myself and I've started kind of getting interested in it again by just simply how good the cell phone is for photographs and recordings. I don't mind the mono aspect of it because everything that you heard in Rainforest Raven was recorded in mono, but then I'm going to spatialize it into stereo and then into 8 channels anyway. And in fact, it's a classical studio technique. You actually often do start with a mono recording and then go from there, which seems ironic in a soundscape work, but it does allow you more flexibility for processing. So I'm not sure I can really answer that question because I do like the way, I make an analogy. My father was a professional photographer, not full-time, but in certain times of his life was. And so I always had a camera, and his mother before him, who was actually the person who raised me. And so it was just normal to have a camera in your hand right from the earliest age, right? So, and my father always taught me a little bit. He was a musician as well, but had kept it as an amateur aspect of his life, whereas I ended up not. And the way that you learn to see through a lens in that classical photographic tradition is quite analytical and quite aesthetic and quite creative. And so you realize that it's an extension of and it extends your viewing. Sure, I mean, I can take a typical, tourist type snap, but I've been trained, my eyes were trained right from an early age to always frame the photograph in a very classical aesthetic kind of way. But basically, then when I started listening with the soundscape work more carefully, I found that it was a fairly similar kind of process. And in fact, I'm not that visual a person, although I love visual art and so on, but it's music and sound that has always inspired me from the earliest age. So that was really a natural thing, is to then, when on the few times that I have done field recording, is to listen more analytically. but mainly I just prefer doing sound walking, even on a daily basis when I'm walking the dog, for instance. It's just a part of my life.
Right,
I'm not sure I can really answer that question,
Sure.
but that has been my experience.
It's interesting because you touched upon the following question by Siri Austin, who's asking, have you worked with sounds for film? And if so, how does the relationship to visuality affect your sonic compositional strategy? So you kind of partially touched upon that.
No, I haven't had the opportunity or the invitation. What you will see, though, on my website, my personal website, just Google my name and it'll come up, are a whole set of videos that I've decided to put onto one page. I have a lot of time now during the pandemic. And so I found it very useful to extend not only the WSP database, but my own personal website. And there's a link right near the top of videos that I've been involved with. Now, they range, of course, from interviews, productions of other people, but there's also videos that I've done. Some of the early ones were done in collaboration with Theo Goldberg. You might see a couple of pictures in my background here. That's not intentional, but they were actually graphics that Theo Goldberg, the late Theo Goldberg, I'm sad to say, had created, and I created the soundtrack with him. And then later, I just find that, for instance, with iMovie, I can do very simple backgrounds or visuals in a variety of contexts. And so it started off as mainly collaboration with computer graphic artists and some videographer such as Tekla Shiphorst at SFU. And then now I do a few simple things myself. I don't know about film. I guess it would have to be an experimental film, but I've always thought that electroacoustic music and soundscape stuff is being ignored a little bit by theater and film. They have such norms that it really is only in very experimental circumstances that they start to take the advantage of the full range of what we can do, right? So it's an intriguing door that could be opened a little bit farther.
Great. Yeah, I've been just remembering Hildegard's words about how soundscape composition or sounds field recordings are not really being used properly, and even in movies that discuss environmental issues are specifically oriented towards environmental issues. So that's that kind of echoes what you said.
Yeah, the film norms are so normalized. I call it the normalization of the artificial. Is that all of the illusions that you're hearing, close miking, even when people are distant, you're having music overlays and underlays, and all of those things are such in the language that everyone has absorbed that it's only experimental filmmakers. A colleague of mine years ago, Ellie Epp, did wonderful experimental films where she was very influenced by sound, and her films, experimental films, are almost like a visualization of sound waves, and they're quite gorgeous. But those are the exceptions that prove the rule. And of course, there's many more. But I just mentioned a particular colleague that I loved her work.
There's one more question we have from Gombasa. There are many examples of how soundscape studies and this kind of work have influenced mainstream or popular culture. Are there some that you feel are particularly interesting or influential?
I frankly don't follow popular culture very well, very much. I have so many other things to do. I have a partner who does social media, so I don't have to. I don't mean to, well, we all know I'm not going to discuss, the pros and cons of popular culture and social media. This is not the place for it. I don't think, again, I'm very well equipped to, I'd like to know what influences this person is thinking of that might, I'm always interested in things that where it would allow people to listen and understand the world differently. And I think we have a lot to add. I would be frankly more interested, and I think historically we are, in getting acoustic ecology on the environmentalist agenda. I'm not worried about pop culture. It'll do what it does. But I think what is really relevant, where we could really, again, this is not we've already started with the World Forum for Acoustic Ecology and that whole community, right? And there's a lot of good work out there. but it is really getting, I think the challenge is to get the acoustic ecology, soundwalking and everything on the environmentalist agenda, because it has a lot to offer. First of all, just at the personal grassroots level is the most obvious. But the idea of the acoustic community and the acoustic habitat that we're forming and acoustic sustainability, they're first of all, they're wonderful models that could be learned from. So much of the problem of climate change and pollution is something that almost has to be handled by experts and specialists. And this is something that we all can make contributions to. So I would rather concentrate my efforts in those kinds of socially relevant directions. Thanks.
Thank you, Barry. I don't think there are any other questions at the moment. Yeah, I think the person who asked the question is trying to be more specific about examples in cinema and music, I think.
Why don't I go back to share screen and I'll just show you some contact information for follow-ups, although you can facilitate things too. Just a second, I'm just going to go back to share screen, and then I have to, oh, sorry, I think I did that wrong. Try it again. I have to click the button. There, okay. And then I'm just going to go back to, well, first of all, I'll mention the WSP database and all, which has 1,000 times more than what you've heard today, including my HTML materials, all the things that I used. And then I'll also mention my affiliation, and then the email if you don't have access to the WSP database, although I think I've given out about 500 guest passwords. It's just an email, truax@sfu.ca. Make sure it's UAX, not something else. You can Google with my name, the personal website that has everything in the public domain, but no sound examples, but includes a lot of the print and visual material and references such as the videos I've talked about and all that. The Sonic Studio website. The WSP database, I don't mean for you to copy this, because if you email me, you'll get the password and you can just sign in to this database, which now includes the new tutorial for the handbook, which is a teaching tool. So if you're interested in any of the techniques, you can get basic information off my personal website, and on the WSP database, there's even a tutorial for that, as well as teaching documents. Everything I did this morning was under the HTML documentation. So in terms of follow-up, besides what you personally can provide, that wouldn't be, these would be some additional resources for follow-up. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you, Barry. This was a great end of the week for us, and the beginning of Friday for you, hopefully. We will continue with the program. Of course, this was the 5th day of Walking Festival of Sound. We will have events again from Monday, but there are a lot of events that we can engage with regardless of time. So there are downloadable soundbox. There's some sonic or listening assignments that you can still sign up for, I believe. And then next week we have another talk. So please check the website. Once again, Barry, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
For this wonderful talk. And thank you for being so generous and also allowing people to get in touch with you. I bet there might be some people writing to you.
It's definitely enjoyable for me too. And I love the way that I assume we are talking to an international group here. And unfortunately, I don't have any way of.
Oh yes, I can just very quickly read to you. People have been saying hello from Brazil, Barcelona, Massachusetts, the UK, Belfast, Liverpool, Venice, Brussels, Poland, Newcastle, Norwich, Costa Rica, Edinburgh, Alberta, Estonia, Groningen, Oslo, Brazil, San Francisco, and so on. I can send you the content of the chat if you want.
Yeah, I'd appreciate that, because I mean it is quite amazing that what we can do, even though it's becoming, I guess, a little bit banal for people. But as I said, I think when you combine this with sound, I think for me, obviously I'm biased, but obviously I think this is much more exciting way of using the technology than the other options. Right.
Definitely.
So again, thank you for all your work in organizing it. Bye for now.
Thank you so much, Mike. Bye.